Edward was a man with a routine and predictable life. He woke up every morning to the blaring sound of his alarm clock, barely allowing the first rays of sunlight to seep through the cracks in the curtains. His day was meticulously planned, with no room for surprises. He worked in a gray office, where piles of documents seemed to grow endlessly. To him, the world was confined to the four walls of his desk and the daily commute between home and work. His mind was preoccupied with reports, deadlines, and goals, as if that was the entire meaning of his existence. Edward avoided problems. He never got involved with social causes or helped anyone in need. He believed that everyone should take care of themselves and that no one should meddle in other people's lives. It wasn't that he was insensitive, but he feared stepping out of his comfort zone and facing the unknown. Deep down, he was afraid of the unpredictable. His life continued in this tedious and predictable routine, where nothing of importance happened. It was like a leaf adrift, carried by the current without direction. Without realizing it, a silent dissatisfaction was growing inside him, a vague feeling that something was missing, as if his existence was empty and meaningless. Little did he suspect that soon, a series of unpredictable events would shake the foundations of his methodical life, leading him down a path he had never imagined. What seemed to be just another ordinary day in his existence would become the turning point that would awaken him to a new reality, a renewed self. This man, who had until then lived as a shadow in the crowd, was about to discover that within him resided a light capable of illuminating not only his own journey, but also that of countless others. Edward's life began to change on a day that, at first glance, seemed like any other. He had left work with a serious and tired expression, carrying with him the same unchanged look he wore daily. The cold night wind brushed against his face as he walked the streets, his head down, absorbed in his own thoughts. On his way home, he passed a park he usually ignored, as if it didn't exist. But on that day, something made him stop. A faint and almost imperceptible sound cut through the air, distinguishing itself from the usual noise of the city. It was the sound of sobbing, muffled and filled with despair. Edward hesitated, looked around, and saw a figure huddled on a bench. A woman, her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands, quietly sobbing. Beside her, a small child with wide, sad eyes held her hand, trying to comfort her. Edward felt a familiar reluctance, an inner whisper telling him to keep walking, not to get involved. But something about the scene held him in place. Perhaps it was the child's gaze, so full of broken innocence, or perhaps it was the deep sadness emanating from the woman. Before he could rationalize his actions, Edward found himself walking toward them. As he approached, he tried to soften his steps, not wanting to startle them. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow stretching under the dim streetlights. The woman looked up, her eyes red and swollen, meeting Edward's. He realized he didn't know what to say, felt ridiculously out of place, but he still crouched slightly, getting closer to the child. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentler than he thought he was capable of. The woman looked at him with a mix of distrust and hope, as if she was about to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. She just shook her head slowly, as if trying to shake off some terrible thought. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. For a moment, he saw himself reflected in those tired and desperate eyes. The same sense of emptiness that haunted him now seemed to echo between them, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a connection. It was as if that encounter, brief and unexpected as it was, had broken the invisible barrier he kept between himself and the rest of the world. Without really knowing why, he sat on the bench next to the woman and child, offering his silent presence. And in that small gesture, without words, something inside him began to change. What started as concern for a stranger was about to turn into something much bigger, something that would pull him out of his bubble of indifference and plunge him into the current of empathy and compassion. In that shared silence, the lack of sound seemed to be the only bond between Edward and the woman beside him. Her tears still fell silently, but now they seemed less desperate, as if Edward's presence, mute as it was, served as a kind of silent comfort. The child watched with wide eyes, his head resting against the woman's arm, sensing the tension in the air ease, if only slightly. Edward, still wordless, took a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to the woman. She hesitated, surprised by the gesture, before taking it with trembling fingers. He noticed her hands, thin and worn, as if life had demanded too much from her in a short time. Edward opened his mouth, a question about to escape, but he swallowed it, fearing to break the fragile moment of understanding they had created. Instead, he waited, allowing time to take its course. It was the man who broke the silence with his trembling voice. "We lost everything. My husband died, and now we have nowhere to go." His words echoed heavily in the air, filled with sadness and anguish. Edward felt a pang in his chest upon hearing the stranger's story. He recognized in that lost look the echoes of his own past, the trials he once faced. He understood well the pain of loss and the uncertainty about the future. At that moment, he saw before him a mirror of his own story, of the battles he had fought alone against the storm. "I understand your grief," he said softly, because he truly did. "I know words don't ease the pain, but maybe I can help somehow." The offer came out spontaneously, driven by the desire to lessen someone else's anguish in some way. For the first time in a long time, he felt the urgency to act in the face of another's suffering and leave his own exile in indifference. The night falling over the city brought with it a moment of stillness in the park, where a man and a woman shared a bench under the dim streetlights. Their eyes revealed the pain of something beyond the shadows that enveloped them. There was a story behind the sadness etched on their faces. She did not question how he could help, for any help, however small, meant more than the total loneliness they faced. Despite the silence, an unspoken promise was made in that place. Edward still didn't know what to do, how to act, but deep inside he knew he wouldn't let them face the darkness alone. A spark ignited in his chest, a faint glow capable of challenging. As the woman wiped away her tears with the cloth he offered, Edward understood that, by trying to save someone from despair, he might find a renewed reason to fight. The night had taken over the park, turning it into a realm of shadows and whispers. The faint streetlights cast a yellowish halo that barely managed to fend off the darkness. But the weak glow was enough to illuminate the weary faces and their thoughtful expressions. There was a singular calmness in that moment, as if the world around had slowed down, offering a refuge where pain and worries could, for a brief moment, be set aside. Edward felt overwhelmed by a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, a growing empathy for the woman and her daughter, an almost instinctual urge to protect them, to do something to alleviate their suffering. On the other hand, the weight of his own uncertainties and doubts, the years of self-imposed solitude that had taught him to distrust any emotional attachment. But as he watched the child nestle closer to her mother, her big eyes still open, staring at him with a mix of curiosity and wariness, he knew he couldn't turn back now. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" The question slipped out before he could think better of it. His tone soft, almost a whisper against the distant noise of the city. The woman shook her head, her expression hardening, as if trying to maintain a strong front for her daughter. We were hoping to find a shelter, but they're all full," she said, her voice revealing a hopelessness that words couldn't hide. Edward nodded, his heart tightening even more. He knew about the challenges of shelters, the constant uncertainty and closed doors. He looked around, as if searching for a solution among the shadows surrounding them. I have a place," he began, hesitating a little. "It's not big, but it's safe. You can spend the night there if you'd like." The proposal hung in the air, heavy and almost tangible. Edward knew what he was offering, aware of the risk of inviting strangers into his life. But at that moment, he was willing to lower his own defenses and solitude to give a night of peace to those who needed it more than he did. The woman studied him for a long time, her distrust evident. But there was something in Edward's eyes, a sincerity she hadn't seen in a long time, a genuine kindness that spoke directly to her tired heart. She looked at her daughter, and something unspoken passed between them, a silent understanding. Turning to Edward, she nodded slowly, a slight tremor in her chin. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and laden with a relief she barely dared to feel. Edward simply smiled, a small smile, but genuine, and stood up, extending a hand to help the woman rise as well. That night, as they walked side by side through the dark streets towards Edward's modest apartment, he felt, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that he was doing the right thing. With each step, the small light inside him grew, dispelling the darkness that had surrounded his soul for so long. Edward's tiny apartment was composed of a single room that combined living room, bedroom, and kitchen, along with a spacious bathroom. The white walls reflected the yellow light of an old lamp, creating a cozy and quiet atmosphere. There was a sense of calm in that space, as if it was a refuge against the hustle and bustle of the world outside. As they entered the room, the woman cast an analytical look around, her shoulders relaxing slightly after the tension. Her daughter, clinging to her mother's hand, peeked around with childish curiosity, her big eyes sweeping over every detail with a mix of apprehension and fascination. "Make yourselves at home," Edward said, gesturing towards the well-worn sofa. "It's not much, but it's all I have." His voice sounded almost shy, as if apologizing for the simplicity of his life. He headed to the tiny kitchen, looking for something to offer them. Leftover canned soup, a few slices of stale bread, nothing extraordinary, but enough to ease the hunger they must have been feeling. While heating the soup on the single-burner stove, he heard the low whisper exchanged between mother and daughter in the small room. The woman was comforting the girl, murmuring gentle words, assuring her that they were safe now. It was such a common scene, laden with normality, that it hit Edward like a blow. The weight of his own loneliness, the absence of human voices in his personal space, suddenly seemed overwhelming. He had forgotten what it was like to share simple moments like those, what it was like to hear someone else breathe the same air. Carefully serving the pots, he brought them into the living room, offering one to each. "It's not much, but it should help," he said, placing the food in front of them. The woman thanked him with a tired smile, which, despite everything, carried a sincere gratitude. The girl, less restrained than her mother, began eating eagerly, the sound of cutlery against the bowls filling the silence. Sitting in an opposite chair, Edward watched. There was something deeply comforting in seeing them eat, in knowing that, for that night, he had made a difference. He hardly knew their names, hardly knew where they came from or where they were going. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for a few hours, he had managed to keep the cold and hunger away from those lives. After they had finished eating, the woman looked at Edward with a renewed sparkle in her eyes. "My name is Isabel," she said, breaking the silence. "And this is my daughter, Mariana." Edward smiled, feeling a strange joy at hearing those names. "I'm Edward," he replied, as if introducing himself to old friends. There was something ceremonial about that moment, an exchange of identities that seemed to seal an invisible pact. Isabel, now more comfortable, began talking about her favorite things, animated in a conversation that, to Edward, sounded like music. Isabel watched, her soft gaze resting on her daughter. There was hope there, a tenuous hope that Edward hadn't noticed before. He realized that even in the toughest times, there was a force that kept those two together, a force of which he was now a part. As the night wore on and the conversations deepened, Edward felt an unexpected feeling awaken within him. It was as if, little by little, the walls that had protected his heart for so long were crumbling, allowing buried emotions to resurface. For the first time in years, he realized that his home truly meant human warmth and not just walls and furniture. He felt part of something greater than his individual self, connected to these two lives in a way he could never have imagined. The night stretched like a blanket over the small apartment, and the hours passed almost imperceptibly as they talked. Isabel and Mariana opened their hearts a little more, their stories flowing with the softness of a river after a long drought. Isabel spoke about how she lost her job, a series of unfortunate events that left her with no place to go. Where to go? Isabel, still so young, talked about the toys they had left behind, about the friends from school, with an innocence that tugged at Edward's heart. While listening, Edward felt a knot forming in his throat, something inside him that seemed to beg to be released. He didn't know how to express what he wanted to say, how to externalize the turmoil of emotions boiling inside him. There was so much he wanted to share, so many questions he wanted to ask, but the words seemed to hide in the darkness of his mind. He knew what it was like to lose, he knew what it was like to feel powerless, but he also knew how hard it was to put that into words. He looked at Isabel, the way she held Isabelna's hand, how their fingers were interlaced, like part of a whole. That sight surprised him in an unexpected way, making him remember his own childhood, when his mother would do the same so he wouldn't feel lost in the vast world. A feeling of loss took root in his chest, and he fought against the tears that threatened to fall. It was a deep desire to belong, to be part of something bigger than his own solitude. "Sometimes I wonder," he began, his trembling voice breaking the silence he himself had built. "I wonder if what we do, the choices we make, really matter. If there's a purpose to all this." He looked at Isabel, hoping for some response, some confirmation that his words didn't sound empty. Isabel observed him with silent understanding, her eyes reflecting the weight of her own experiences. She knew what he was talking about, the same thought that accompanied her in the darkest moments. "I wonder about that too," she replied softly. "But I believe we have to keep going, believing that there's a reason for everything, that even in the worst moments, there are lessons to be learned, things to be gained, and maybe helping each other is the only answer that really matters." The words Edward heard awakened something deep inside him, something he thought had been buried long ago. A mix of emotions flooded him: sadness, relief, fear, and hope all at once. There were no ready-made answers, he knew that now. But maybe, just maybe, the bond he felt with Isabel and Isabelna meant there was something more beyond loneliness and agony. Something valuable to explore, something valuable to keep alive. As Isabel and Edward talked, Isabelna yawned, her eyes slowly closing. She snuggled closer into her mother's arms, seeking comfort. Isabel looked at Edward with a smile full of understanding and kindness. It was then that Edward realized they were not alone anymore. An invisible connection had formed between them that night, built with unspoken words and shared feelings. As the early morning crept in, Edward felt that not even the deepest darkness could completely extinguish the fragile light of hope that still burned in his chest. In moments like that, all that was required was a solitary gesture, an arm extended to another in an attempt to rekindle the dormant embers. The silence enveloped them like a comforting cloak, laden with unspoken promises. Edward felt something move within him, as if a door that had been closed until now was opening to reveal new paths. His thoughts still bubbled up confusedly, but one certainty emerged clearly. He longed to help, not just for them but for himself too. He wanted to be part of something capable of giving meaning to his own journey. Isabel rose gently, taking care not to wake Isabelna, who was now peacefully asleep. She gestured for Edward to follow her into the modest kitchen. As they moved, the faint moonlight spilled silver across the room, bringing an unexpected serenity. In the kitchen, Isabel took a mug and prepared tea in an automatic, almost meditative motion, a silent choreography she probably repeated every night. Edward watched her in silence, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, for a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist. She served a mug for each of them, sitting at the narrow table that barely accommodated two people. Isabel looked at him, her face softened by the soft light, her eyes depicting a deep tranquility. "You know, Edward," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "sometimes all we need is a small act of kindness, something to remind us that there is still kindness in the world, that there is still hope." The dark night finally ended, giving way to a new day. Edward and Isabel talked for hours on end, sharing their anxieties and hopes. Each word brought relief, reinforcing the bond they were building step by step. Isabelna woke up before dawn, eager for another day. Seeing Edward asleep on the sofa, she couldn't help but laugh. She ran to the kitchen, where her mother was making breakfast. Tugging at Isabel's skirt, She asked if he would be staying. In the girl's eyes, there was a sparkle of excitement at the thought of a larger family. Stroking her daughter's hair, Isabel assured her that Edward would be a part of their days. The smile on Isabelna's face showed the joy of having someone to rely on. Upon waking, Edward smelled fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee. Although tired, he felt light, free from the anguish that had haunted him until then. He followed the aroma to the kitchen, ready to start a new chapter alongside those he already considered family. Isabel was walking back and forth in the room, moving with a surprising lightness given the weight of her responsibilities. Isabelna was sitting at the table, her eyes shining brightly with excitement. "Good morning," she exclaimed when she saw Edward enter. He smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to have disappeared from his face a long time ago. "Good morning, little one," he replied, sitting next to her. Isabel brought him a steaming cup of coffee and a plate full of golden toast. They ate in comfortable silence, interrupted only by Isabelna's laughter and the soft clinking of utensils on the table as Isabel served them. "What are we going to do today?" Isabelna asked, her voice full of anticipation with every syllable. Edward looked at Isabel, who shrugged with a small smile on her lips. "Maybe we could go to the park," she suggested. "Some fresh air would be nice." Edward nodded in agreement. He didn't know what the next hours would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt open to the possibilities that fate might bring. A comforting warmth filled his chest, the comfort of belonging to a family he thought he had lost. Sharing that quiet breakfast with Isabel and Isabelna seemed to heal old wounds in his soul. As they prepared to leave, Edward felt filled with a newfound determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he would no longer be alone. As long as he had Isabel and Mariana by his side, he could face any challenge. And so, with the sunlight streaming through the windows, promising a new day full of possibilities, they set out together, ready to face whatever challenges fate had in store for them. Every step they took was a reminder that life, despite all its complexities, could still be beautiful, could still be filled with hope and love. And this, more than anything else, was what sustained Edward. Isabel rose delicately, trying not to wake Mariana, who was now sleeping soundly. She gestured for Edward to follow her to the small kitchen. In the kitchen, Isabel took a mug and began to make tea. Her movements were automatic, almost meditative, a silent choreography she likely repeated every night. Edward watched her in silence, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, for a brief moment, the outside world had ceased to exist. She served a mug for him and another for herself, sitting at the small table that barely fit two people. Isabel looked at him, her face softened by the gentle light, her eyes reflecting a deep serenity. "You know, Edward," she said slowly, as if carefully choosing her words, "sometimes what we need is a small act of kindness, something that reminds us there is still goodness in the world, that there is still hope." Edward held the warm mug, feeling the heat spread through his fingers, a pleasant contrast to the coldness of fear and uncertainty that still lingered over him. He knew what he wanted to say, but he wasn't sure how to put it into words. He wanted to be that act of kindness. He wanted to be that small ray of light for Isabel and Mariana, just as they had been for him. "I want to help," he finally declared, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, determined. "I don't know how, but I want to be a part of this. I want to make a difference." His words were simple but carried a weight he could hardly describe. It was more than just a desire to help. It was a longing to find himself, to reconnect with a greater purpose. Isabel smiled gently, her eyes shining with something that might have been hope. "Sometimes just being present is enough," she replied. "Sometimes the presence of someone who cares makes all the difference." She took his hand, squeezing it with a tenderness that almost made him cry. In that simple touch, Edward felt a connection he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. As they sipped their tea in silence, Edward knew he had found something valuable. It wasn't answers to all his questions, nor a solution to all his problems, but it was a start, the beginning of something that could grow, that could transform into something greater. In the quiet of the night, Sitting with Isabel, Edward realized that maybe life wasn't about finding all the answers. Maybe it was about being present, being willing to help, being open to whatever the future brought. It was about accepting vulnerability, finding strength in gentleness and mutual support. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew that together, they could face whatever came. And that, for him, was already a start. After hours of deep conversation, Edward and Isabel enjoyed a moment of peace, absorbing the mutual comfort that only genuine understanding can offer. Mariana woke up early as usual, eager to start a new day. Upon seeing the unexpected sight of Edward asleep on the sofa, her joy burst into peals of laughter that echoed through the still quiet apartment. Within moments, she ran to the kitchen, eager to share the news with her mother. "Will he be staying with us from now on?" she asked, hoping for a positive answer. Isabel smiled gently at her daughter's innocent enthusiasm, stroking her hair affectionately. "I think so, dear. Edward will be a part of our family," she whispered in response, bringing comfort to the child's soul. Satisfied, Mariana skipped off to enjoy the charms of the dawning morning. For her, Edward's presence was a source of joy and security. When Edward woke up, he found himself surrounded by the aroma of coffee and warm bread filling every corner of the home. Although his body was still tired, he realized his spirit was waking up light, free of the weight from before. With a serene smile, he followed the scent of hope to the kitchen. Isabel was there, moving gracefully despite the tension of her chores. Mariana sat at the table, her eyes sparkling with renewed energy. "Good morning," she exclaimed as she saw Edward enter. He smiled, a genuine smile that hadn't appeared in a long time. "Good morning, little one," he replied, settling next to her. Isabel brought him a steaming cup of coffee and a plate full of warm toast. They ate in comfortable silence, interrupted only by Mariana's laughter and the soft clinking of cutlery. "So, what shall we do today?" Mariana asked, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. Edward looked at Isabel, who shrugged with a tender smile on her lips. "I think we could go to the park," she suggested. "How about some fresh air?" Edward nodded in agreement. He didn't know what the day would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he was open to possibilities. He felt warmth in his chest, a sense of belonging he thought he would never feel again. It was as if the simple act of being there, sharing a quiet breakfast with Isabel and Mariana, was healing the wounds of his soul. As Isabel made the final preparations for the outing, a calm determination settled in her heart. She couldn't predict what the future would hold, but she knew she wouldn't face the challenges ahead alone. With Mariana and Edward by her side, she felt ready for anything. So, under the morning sun that promised a new day full of possibilities, the three of them left the house together, ready to face whatever else might come. With each step, the certainty renewed that, despite the turmoil, life could be beautiful and full of hope. And it was precisely this hope that had given Isabel the strength to move forward. Later, at the park, under the canopy of trees against a clear blue sky, Isabel felt a peace she hadn't known before. They sat on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree as a gentle breeze blew. "I felt lost for a while," Edward began hesitantly. Isabel held his hand tenderly, encouraging him to continue. "I thought that by avoiding people and my feelings, the pain would disappear. But since meeting you two, I've realized I was wrong. Sharing the pain makes the burden lighter." Isabel nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "We all carry emotional scars, Edward, but they're not just marks of pain. They're symbols of survival. They remind us that we've overcome challenges greater than we imagined." Edward looked at the horizon, where Mariana swung joyfully in the breeze, her hair dancing in the wind. At that moment, everything made sense. He realized that despite the losses, there was still much to be lived. He didn't need to cling to the past or agony. A life full of simple and beautiful moments, laughter, and affection awaited him. "Thank you," he finally said, gratitude overflowing in his voice. "Thank you for reminding me of what really matters." Isabel smiled, a smile that conveyed all her strength and compassion. "You were never alone, Edward, and you never will be. We're here for you always." They sat in silence, enjoying the park's tranquility. The rustling of leaves, Mariana's distant laughter. Everything seemed a gentle reminder that life goes on. That despite the difficulties, there is always a way to move forward. When Edward and his new companions finally left the park, a feeling of lightness filled his heart. Each step toward home seemed to renew his strength. Each breath brought new hope. He looked at Isabel and Mariana with a smile, grateful for the journey they would share from that day on. Along the way, Mariana grabbed Edward's hand, swinging it playfully. "Can I count on you to come back tomorrow?" she asked, her eyes full of hope. Edward smiled back, feeling invigorated with every heartbeat. "Of course, my little one," he answered confidently. "We'll enjoy every day at the park together from now on." And so, with hearts renewed by the compassion and purpose they found in each other, they moved forward, confident in the future. For where there is kindness to warm lonely days and hands to help those who falter, a new beginning is always possible. Edward discovers in Isabel and Mariana's strength of spirit the scars that transform him. The lesson is that true healing is born from affection, the courage to face pain, and the willingness to rebuild life through others. Have you ever felt that a simple act of kindness changed your life? Just as Edward found hope alongside Isabel and Mariana, your story could inspire others too. Share your experience in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this journey of overcoming challenges and finding love, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next heartwarming stories. Together, let's spread kindness and empathy.